How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew. This is Lemora's Cards, and today we're going over part one of probably a short series on the 2026 cEDH metagame. Understanding it from a beginner perspective, you can watch this if you don't know anything about cEDH, and I'll help explain what the format is, how to get into it, kind of some things to keep in mind as you learn it, and then going over the main staples of the format, why they're so ubiquitous, and breaking down the major archetypes and some decks you can expect to see within those archetypes, and attempting to make archetypes a useful part of cEDH. I think a lot of the old terminology, if you watch some of my old guides, is kind of useless in what the actual game looks like now. Doing a bit more to try to help new people understand the format and also give people maybe some more terminology and a better understanding of what the game really is and not sort of these preconceived ideas we maybe have of it. If you enjoy this video, like, comment, subscribe, let me know down below what you think of cEDH and how you're trying to get into it, why you're trying to get into it. You have some friends that play at your locals and you want to be able to put a deck together to play with them. Maybe you see some gameplay, you want to try it out. This next part of this series, probably my next video, should be a pretty in-depth guide on all the major decks of the format, probably going over 10-ish decks from a beginner perspective on explaining all those. We're going to talk about them a bit today, but we're going to really dive into those in this next episode. So if you want to make sure you don't miss that one, make sure to subscribe. And I think with all that being said, we can go ahead and hop into it.
Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want, really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try.
What is cEDH? It sounds simple, but it is. Commander played competitively. That is all cEDH is, competitive EDH. It really is just approaching the Commander ban list and rules from a competitive perspective. One thing I often hear is people say that it's Commander ramped up to 11 or what, maybe amped up. That makes more sense. Amped up to 11. But I think for most decks and most of the archetypes, and we'll be talking about those later, it's more accurate to say it is bringing a competitive mindset into the Commander card pool and legality. It's not really taking a bracket 3 or 4 casual Simic lands deck or dragon 5-color thing and bringing it up to cEDH. Much more accurate to think of it as coming from the top down of how do I break this card pool? Now, there's a lot of overlap with that and the casual staples that you might see, especially as the game has really amped up in power level over in casual. But I think it's a little bit more accurate to think of the game that way. And it is a very established metagame. cEDH has been a thing for way longer than I've been playing it. And now it is the most established it's ever been. There's tons of tournaments. You're going into a cEDH game with a good expectation of what your opponents are doing, or at the very least, what they're trying to counter. The way a metagame works, especially if you're coming from casual Commander, it is kind of an arms race, but it's more targeted. You know, for a real metagame, you need a target to try to beat, and you're building your deck around that, which is why you will often hear people say, please don't brew your own deck, because you wouldn't bring your own deck into Modern or something if you literally knew nothing about the format. You don't look at the Modern card pool and decide, this is my Modern deck, I'm going to go win. I guess it isn't even Modern Pro Tours anymore. I don't even remember. But you want to go in with a good understanding of the format because there's a lot to know. What is that established metagame? It is incredibly interactive. I would think that cEDH is the most interactive type of Magic you can play. It is very similar to Vintage if you've played that, and we'll go over the card pool and exactly why that is, where it's pretty common all 4 people are playing blue and all of them are playing most of the reasonable free interaction that you can be playing in the format. This leads to very interactive games of Magic where if someone's attempting to win turn 1, turn 2, the whole pod might have a little bit of free interaction, might be drawing cards off of all that free interaction. It gets crazy pretty fast. It is a very high overall power level format. We are just under Vintage in terms of like really established format. How we compare to like Canlander and stuff like that is a little weird with point systems, but we're pretty high up there, especially before they banned Mana Crypt and Dockside, which is similar to Commander. That's Commander's power level. It just most people don't play there. It is the most complex and unique way to play Magic in my perspective. Doesn't inherently mean it's better than everything else, but it's so different. Multiplayer brought up into this perspective of we're trying to compete, we're trying to win. It's not necessarily cutthroat as the vibe, but when you take a game action that I think is going to put you ahead, I'm going to interact with it. And the complexities that occur in multiplayer, where maybe 2 players want something to happen, 2 other players want something to happen, and they're going back and forth both in the game and politically to try to get to the game state that they want to end at to help them win the game. That can kind of turn some people off the competitive aspect. Instead of thinking of it as competitive Magic, but we've thrown in this random political nonsense into the game, I think it's better to think of it as bringing the appeal to multiplayer social games and the almost like the sort of strategic and tactical elements of a very complex simulation, right? Where you're trading resources like Euro games almost, where I'm going to do something for this person, they're going to do something for me, and I can expect them to do this for me. But at some point, one of us has to win. It's a very interesting type of gameplay you don't really get anywhere else. And easily, not even close, the biggest grassroots competitive scene in Magic. It is so huge now, it's unbelievable. We're going to go over some of the resources where you can look at tournaments. I would not be surprised if there's more than 500,000 in prize support this year for cEDH. I think it's going to be a lot bigger than that, actually. CCS on their own is doing like over 150,000, tons of 10Ks, 20Ks all year. Plenty of events for you to travel to, plenty of online play to be had. So how should you approach cEDH? Like we mentioned, throwing out your old perceptions of how Commander works, kind of going to be a big one. Your cultivates and your big rampy do nothing enchantments aren't really going to cut it here. It is much better to think of this as a new format. It really isn't. And some of those elements of Commander, especially depending on the kind of bracket and gameplay you were experiencing, are going to be relevant. They're going to apply, but you should really come in like you're learning a new format, and you should learn it like a tournament format and play what works. I think that's huge for this format because it's so complicated. It would be very difficult to go to like a Pioneer or Modern or Legacy, whatever tournament with literally no knowledge of what the format looks like. Expect to build a deck to beat a meta that you don't know and have that go well. Here, every game you're seeing 3 decks. So the amount of information in like a normal 7-round game, you're talking 21 potential different decks that you're playing against. Not to mention if you make it a top cut, and not to mention that those decks might be different than each other. There will be Rogthras decks that are full creature based. There will be decks that are Underworld Breach packages and more of a Stormy element. There's going to be decks that are fully throwing away interaction and ramping out Atalis. And that's in like one commander pairing. And you could reasonably see a lot of those different things in one tournament. I think you're going to make your life a lot easier by just picking one of these decks. And we're going to be going over the archetypes of the format and why you might enjoy one of these and give you a good kind of on-ramp to getting to a deck that you'll enjoy. And then really for anything you do, but especially in cEDH, approach each game as a learning experience. It's complicated. There's a lot going on. Expect that you're going to have a below average win rate at the start and approach those games like you're trying to figure stuff out. When you get your first win, you're going to feel amazing. It will be awesome. You're going to feel fantastic. It might take a little bit to get there, and that's part of learning a new game as established as this one. Also, huge notable thing I want to make sure I put at the top of the video, cEDH is the most proxy-friendly tournament format, period. All those 20Ks and stuff I mentioned, the vast majority, like 90+% of them, are fully proxy-friendly. You do not need to spend 10 grand to have a cEDH deck. You can get it for much cheaper than that. Nobody even turn an eye at you. Most people in most tournaments will be using proxies. Going into the cEDH staples, first talking about the mana base of cEDH. We are a fetch land, dual land format. Fetches and duals are the pillar of high color strategies especially. They would not function without these. You will see lower color decks also use the shock lands, and surveil lands are like decently common because they're kind of broken. Ancient Tomb and other soul land effects are quite popular. Other cards like City of Traders also expect to see here. Anything that's just going to get you ahead in mana, that's a huge part of this format. Starting Town and other 5-color rainbow lands you will expect to see as well. Even in lower color decks, but especially in high color decks, cards like Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, even Forbidden Orchard, and Tarnished Citadel with like much steeper downsides you'll see in this format. Channel lands are among the best utility lands in the format. Being able to interact in a way that's very difficult to interact with is incredibly powerful. I mentioned we're a super interactive format, and a lot of the format is also about shutting down interaction. So if you're sitting behind a silence effect, Besage You is often the thing one of you is just hoping somebody has to stop the Underworld Breach one attempt. You also have very powerful build around sort of game changer lands like Gaia's Cradle. Gaia's Cradle is probably the most iconic one of these and the most defining one, but it wouldn't be uncommon to see other really impactful lands like Mishra's Workshop, and even stuff like Shifting Woodland can kind of go into this tier as well in some of the Aftermath Analyst land strategies that we'll get to talk about. Very impactful utility lands. You're not going to see too many of these in higher color decks, but things like Emergent Zone, which can be incredibly impactful, being able to play at flash speed on other people's turns. You'll see other ones, especially in land stacks, but just know that there's definitely a place for colorless utility lands and even some colored ones in the format. Similar with like Talon Gates. This is another interactive thing. It's part of the crop rotation package that a lot of decks utilize. It's also part of some combos, which I don't know if we'll talk about those Talon Gates combos today, but there are some major utility lands that all work differently. You know, Besage You, E-Zone, Talon Gates are all unique in how they operate, and they're all like equally a major part of the format. Continuing to talk about mana, we also have the broken mana or the acceleration of the format. We're very, very heavy on cheap artifact mana, the free rocks. You know, it was a huge hit when Mana Crypt got gone. You now have staples like Mox Diamond and Chromox, which are in like 90+% of decks that can run them, especially competitive lists. Mox Opal, you will see because we're so heavy on these sort of fast mana effects. The Signet effects definitely got hurt a little bit more when Crypt went because it was so broken to go land, Crypt, Signet, anything else, and still are powerful. You will still see them, especially in higher color decks, but they're not quite as ubiquitous as they were. Their staple status is questioned in a few decks. You also will see a lot of one-time mana usage, like a Lotus Petal, Mana Vault, and Dark Ritual. Ritual effects in general, quite popular, especially in a couple of the archetypes we'll be talking about today, as well as Mana Dorks. Green has had a really big resurgence in the past year. It is a major player, and there are a lot of very green-heavy decks. Those will lean into good Mana Dorks like Birds of Paradise, Delighted Halfling, Deathrite Shaman, and even a couple higher mana value but more impactful ones like Faber Elder and Bloom Tender. The engines of cEDH are a major part of the play patterns of this format. These are a lot of the most extreme power outliers. These are the cards that invisibly or sometimes very visibly win the game. It's important to know and to consider that you take roughly, on average, 25% of the game actions in a game. 75% of the cards drawn, the spells cast, game actions taken are going to be your opponents. Therefore, it is very much to your benefit to play these sort of what I would call parasitic engines that rely on your opponents taking game actions to give you advantage, because your opponents will have to take game actions. Somebody casts a turn 1 Ristic Study, pay the 1 is not always a winning strategy. Maybe if they have nothing else in hand, but if you guys let them, develop and they just time warp you multiple turns in a row, doesn't really work too well. You got to play through these effects. So cards like Mystic Remora, which are pretty much unpayable, paying 4 mana, are kind of time limited, and now you have to keep paying mana to keep it around. Ristic Study, probably the most powerful card in cEDH, you could definitely argue. Certainly the most divisive and warping. This is like a card people almost dread to see in the early turns, and a lot of games are won and lost by it. Esper Sentinel, very similar to Mystic Remora. Fairy Mastermind is a card we've seen a lot of because these other effects are so omnipresent. If all of our opponents are drawing lots of cards, other effects like Fairy Mastermind and Smothering Tithe that take advantage of that are going to be pretty good as well. You also see cards like Lotho, which will give you some mana for opponents casting their second spell. You also see Crom as a popular commander. And you do see a few proactive engines, but again, like I mentioned, a lot of the reactive or parasitic opponent-based stuff is the common stuff and will be some of the most powerful. The One Ring is still fairly common in our format, especially with decks that can repeatedly untap it, using lands like Manamo or the key effects like Manifold Key. And then cards like Ragavan that just sort of draw you a card, make you a treasure. Ragavan can be very powerful. The more creature-based the format is, the more he kind of dips away in popularity, but still quite a powerful card. And I think reasonable to consider an engine. But you have other cards like Professional Facebreaker in the Timna style decks that we'll be talking about. Next, the Wincons. I'm not going to be going over all the cEDH combos today. I do have a video going over that. I should link that up here. But I will talk about the main combos that you should be aware of and the types of combos you should be aware of. Thassa's Oracle gets a lot of the attention of especially casual players. It isn't really the biggest combo in the format. It is very popular, but a lot of times it's not the main thing you go for because it's so low card quality. But Thassa's Oracle, when combined with Demonic Consultation, exiling your library, or Tainted Pact, you can, for 3 or 4 mana, depending which of those cards you use, win the game. Exile your library, Thassa's Oracle trigger on the stack, it says you win. Much more commonly, the game is actually about assembling a Thoracle or other, whatever your win con is, by getting access to your whole deck. Very common with Underworld Breach. Underworld Breach lets you cast non-land cards from your graveyard by exiling 3 cards. If you get Brain Freeze, which has Storm, mill 3 cards, so you can mill 3 for every spell cast this turn, and Lion's Eye Diamond, which is going to make you 3 mana, discard your hand. You can use Underworld Breach, crack your Lion's Eye Diamond for blue, Brain Freeze yourself, mill a bunch of cards, recast the Lion's Eye Diamond, exiling cards, breach out your Brain Freeze, mill most of your deck to get access to Thassa's Oracle, as well as all the protection you could need. And you can also mill out all your opponents. This is essentially drawing your deck in a way that lets you repeatedly use a whole bunch of resources and loop some spells. Basalt Monolith is not the most common win condition anymore, but it's just kind of here to represent infinite mana. There are a lot of infinite mana decks, specifically decks with an outlet in the command zone. This could be Thrasios, Could be Kinnan, could be even Marnius. Non-green decks do it too. But there are lots of infinite mana decks that typically use infinite mana to get access to their entire deck, cast some sort of outlet for their infinite mana, and win the game from there with every piece of interaction possible. These next two aren't strictly win conditions, but they essentially assemble a win con in a way that you would treat them as a win attempt. Ad Nauseam was the de facto kind of archetype defining card of the format before the bans. Now it's definitely fallen off, but still treated as a win. Decks built around Ad Nauseam will often build for a low mana curve so that you can get access to lots of different cards that lets you reveal a card, lose life equal to the mana value, put it in your hand. So you can cast a bunch of rituals like Dark Ritual, Lotus Petal, whatever, cast Ad Nauseam, get access to a bunch of your deck. And if you're running a lot of those zeros and those cheap rituals, you can then convert that into an Underworld Breach win because it requires very few resources to get that going. Necropotence is kind of similar. You can also lump this in with the engines if you use a fair Necropotence to just pay life to functionally draw cards. But when paired with cards like Born Upon a Wind, Valley Floodcaller, or Final Fortune, essentially flash enablers that let you use all the cards you got, it essentially becomes another win condition, giving you access to most of your deck, dumping your cards and winning the game. Arguably as defining as the engines are the interaction of the format. This is why games do not always end on turn 2, because we are the most interaction heavy format, period. Expect to see free interaction like Force of Will, Fierce Guardianship, Mental Misstep. There's lots of cheap, efficient cards in our format. Mental Misstep's going to have a lot of targets. People will be casting lots of spells to do those win lines that we were talking about. Typically, people casting lots of spells. Mindbreak Trap is just 0 mana, exile the stack. So we have lots of free stuff like this in our sort of blue slot. You also have Deflecting Swat as another similar card to Fierce Guardianship. But we do have cards that cost mana to interact with. Usually they have a little bit of a higher bar to clear. They need a lot of targets, or they need to be difficult to interact with or more unique. Flusterstorm, storm count gets very high. Flusterstorm something, it's very difficult to pay for. Usually you have to get some other way around it, like using your own fluster or Mindbreak Trapping the fluster. Red Elemental Blast. As you can see by this page and almost everything I'm going to show today, we're a very blue heavy format. So 1 mana, counter a blue thing, blow up a blue thing, very impactful. Silence. I mentioned most of the game actions are our opponents. If we can shut out our opponent's ability to take game actions, it's going to lead to us winning the game pretty easily. And then you also will see a decent amount of board-based interaction, kind of skews depending on what the metagame is and what colors you're in. But typically cards like Swords to Plowshares, even Deadly Rawlick, bounce-based removal like Chain of Vapor, not uncommon at all in the format. How do we get all this stuff together? Other than drawing a million cards to Ristic Study, we tutor for it. You've got cards like Demonic Tutor, which is straight to hand. Beseech the Mirror, which is straight to the stack. You can bargain it, use that to go cast your Underworld Breach or your Necropotence. Gamble is a risky tutor. Sometimes you just use it as is, just tutor and hope it goes well. But also, if you have Underworld Breach in play, that's just another tutor. It's just a 1 mana way to put a card in your hand. You don't care where it ends up. Top deck tutors are very common in the format. Enlightened Tutor, Mystical Tutor, and Vampiric Tutor are all very popular. Many of the green decks often go for straight to the battlefield tutors like Finale of Devastation, which search for a creature puts into play. Eldritch Evolution, which has you sacrifice a creature and put something that costs up to 2 more mana into play than the sacrificed creature. Intuition is a part of a lot of the Underworld Breach strategies. You can use that to assemble your breach pile, and then a card to get back cards from the graveyard like your Savine's Reclamation, which you can use to guarantee that you get an Underworld Breach in play and access to whatever you need to do the combo. Cards like Spellseeker and even new cards like Formidable Speaker are really common in blue-green centric tutor chain kind of decks that don't have access to black tutors, but have access to a toolbox of cards they want to pull from. So even more limited cards like Spellseeker, I can use Finale to get my Spellseeker to go get another card, or I can use Spellseeker to go get Finale to go get a creature. So you have these sort of overlapping combo chains that you can pull off with these tutors. And then the last category I have is just sort of unique effects. Things that you might want access to in a game of cEDH. Final Fortune gives you a 2 mana extra turn. You die at the end of it, but win before that. Wheel of Fortune and the other wheel effects is not totally unique, but it's not uncommon for decks to want a wheel type effect to fully reload. Wheel of Fortune, when paired with Lionside Diamond and Breach, lets you keep wheeling over and over until you get what you want, or you could kill your opponents with an Orcish Bowmaster that's in play. You saw lots of those draw engines. You're going to see lots of creatures today. Orcish Bowmasters gets to feed on a lot of those different things. Born Upon a Wind, we talked about with Necropotence. It is just good in general in a format where lots of people are interacting. Say 2 people are trying to stop something. A third player is on one of their sides. The big sack war ensues. you've been drawing a bunch of cards off of this, and then when they look to you to stop the win attempt, you Born Upon a Wind and do your own win. Not at all an uncommon play pattern cEDH. Savine's Reclamation I mentioned as being able to get back cards from the graveyard, part of those intuition piles. Ranger Captain of Eos is another silence effect, but you can crack this on your turn to shut out your opponent so you can win, or use it defensively when someone else goes for a win attempt. Culling Ritual is just broken. If you cast a spell, you make 1,000,000 mana, everybody's stuff's blown up. And then Clone Effects. Pretty common in cEDH, a little less common on Dockside is banned, but Mockingbird is a good pair with Ranger Captain to get 2 Ranger Captains, or maybe to clone an opponent's Orcish Bowmasters to get your own. Next up, we're going to be talking about the archetypes of cEDH. Now, if you've been playing for a while or even kind of kept up with the format, you've probably heard that the macro archetypes of cEDH are Turbo, Stacks, and Midrange. I think these terms are kind of useless, and they also don't even describe the actual macro archetypes of the format anymore. Stacks is virtually non-existent, and I think they're very reductive in terms of describing what these decks actually do. So instead of these very broad macro archetypes that maybe exist in our format, I wanted to talk about what I think most of the format actually fall under. Not every deck is going to neatly slide into one of these, and a lot of these are more of a spectrum that you can exist on, right? There are decks that are Esper Midrange and have elements of Naus, Necro, Turbo, and that have elements of Simic Big Mana. I think most decks in the format right now fall under one or more of these archetypes, which I've defined as Esper Midrange, Naus, Necro, Turbo, Simic Big Mana, red-based Storm, lands, and Commander Toolbox. And if a deck doesn't fall under these, most of the ones that I could find that didn't, they are really just defined by their commander and are very commander-centric. And that's a cool thing about our format is you can build a deck around your commander and it's going to play completely different than any other deck in the format, really, because it has this unique defining aspect of it that you get access to every single game. So not everything neatly falls under these, but I think most decks do. Esper Midrange. Now, when I say Esper Midrange, I mean the Esper core, specifically blue-based always, and then leaning into blue-white, blue-black, or all 3 colors. Generally. This is where a lot of the best engines and interaction in the format is. Your Lothos, Smothering Tides, Flusterstorms, Ristics, all that stuff. So it's very clearly pointing you in that direction. When they're built to be a Esper core deck, they often look to develop and control early and grind out their opponents in the late game. Get these engines down, make sure nobody wins early, and then grind out this inevitability. Because if you have a Smothering Tithe and a Ristic Study, you're going to eventually get to win the game, or at least try. These decks often are not super commander centric, though they can be. So they usually rely on tutors and high card quality cards, meaning cards that are generically good in most scenarios. Like Ristic Study is a pretty high quality card. Same with Demonic Tutor, because in most scenarios, they're going to be reasonably useful versus a more synergistic card that needs other moving parts to get it to work. So, like I mentioned, Esper Midrange will be defined by some of these cards that are staples, but these are staples that they will definitely run. Esper Sentinel, Lotho, Tataru, which is kind of a Lotho at home. They're willing to kind of dig a little deeper sometimes on more of these pieces so that they can see more of them, right? We're playing a 100-card singleton format. So if you really want access to a Lotho-like effect, you would play 2 strictly worse Lothos, right? Tataru, mostly significantly worse. You might play one even worse than this if you wanted to really play a sit back, control the game Esper pile. These kind of decks are more likely to lean into asymmetric hate, not as often into stacks, but sometimes, but cards that are powerful and shut down your opponent's ability to win mostly, right? Orcish Bowmasters makes it very difficult for creature-based decks to get going. Draenith Magistrate really shuts down commander-based strategies. Opposition Agent is generically good in general. You're going to be able to fire this off and take somebody else's tutor. It will also make it much more difficult for decks to assemble their win conditions, and especially those tutor chain decks I talked about with like Spellseeker, to be able to perform their game plan. These decks are way more likely to lean into more prohibitive pieces to stop their opponents. Mana Drain probably seems like a cEDH card from a casual perspective, but 2 mana pips, like we talked about, there's so much free interaction. You really have to mean it to play a card like Mana Drain. You have to really be sitting around holding open mana and have something to do with it. So like a deck is much more likely to play a card like this because they're going to hold open interaction, wait for a good target, and use a card like Mana Drain to help them push ahead because they had to spend their resources on stopping other people from winning, and they maybe couldn't develop as much. Commandeer, very warping control tool, but it's a 3-for-1. If it gets countered, it's very intense and you need a very high blue count, and these decks can be as many as 5 colors, so you have to really mean it. Grafdigger's Cage shuts out a lot of those win conditions we talked about. All those creature tutor lines stopped. Underworld Breach does not work. So most of the decks that are going to run this card have to really mean it and have to avoid those kind of win conditions. They're more likely to lean into maybe an infinite mana outlet or just a raw Thassa's Oracle win behind lots of interaction. Like I mentioned, you don't need to be full Esper to lean into the core of this. Any mono blue deck can choose to be a control deck. If you put every counterspell in your deck and every way to draw cards in your deck, you can attempt to control the game. So you will see decks like Urza or other mono blue or even like blue red decks that I would consider playing in this space. But often when you add these other colors like Shortcut, adding blue white gets you access to those smothering ties, those silence effects that we talked about, cards that are going to help better shut out your opponents and push you ahead. And then you add another color like Tivit, adding black, you get access to all those tutors that we talked about that give you a better toolbox to pull from and option to find exactly what you need at any given moment. And when you do get a window to win, to actually go find a win con and push. It's also very common for other decks that aren't purely about being an Esper mid-range to lean into that. A lot of the decks like this are going to be Tymna and a blue partner. So Tymna and Thrasios is what I would consider Esper mid-range, but they can also lean into Simic Big Mana, which we'll talk about. They use green to help develop their mana, as well as use some of those generically powerful green cards to have access to creature tutors. You also see Tymna Crom decks that will play more like Esper mid-range, where they sit back, look to interact with the opponents, draw off of their commanders, and then close out the game with a silence effect or Grand Abolisher, and then look to win like that. But they also might lean into Naus Necro Turbo, which we'll talk about. So there's a bit of a gradient where decks can be in more than one basket. They'll just tend to pull from one of these things. Esper midrange, I think you should play. If you want agency in every single game, you have lots of interaction, you have lots of generically good cards, it's going to be uncommon you just don't get to play unless somebody wins like turn one, or you just had a really bad mulligan. These decks are built to be the generically best decks. You value consistency over high rolling. Like I mentioned, you're not having to mulligan super deep for specific combos. You're not really trying to do that. You're trying to just stay alive, draw some cards, make some mana, win on your own time, stop other people from winning. And then you prefer a flexible reactive game plan, especially once you add those black tutors in. You have lots of ability to pivot between different game plans. You can look for a stacks piece, you can look for a draw engine, you can look for interaction. You know, your top deck tutors, when combined with draw engines, let you instant speed decide your entire game plan based on what your opponents are doing. You get lots of ability to kind of sit back and plot and be the bad guy that pretends to be the good guy. Next, we're going to be talking about Naus Necro Turbo. These are generally the faster decks. These are the good stuff version of going fast. You can sidestep traditional development with explosive Rakdos rituals. These decks will often also play like the fast rocks we mentioned, like Mox Diamond, but they're maybe a little less likely to play as many of the talisman effects. Don't need to do it as often. They don't rely on doing that because they have more explosive potential with their higher density of ritual type effects that just help you push these very impactful spells early in the game. They're going to use their life as a resource for cards like Necropotence and Ad Nauseam, which you mentioned. These are sort of the namesake cards. These cards both let you take some mana, mostly black mana, and turn that into cards at the cost of your life. Those cards inherently are going to be more impactful the more life you have. And when other players at the table know you're one of these strategies, they're going to pressure that, which pushes you to make your game decisions and game plan more compact because you don't want people to get to smack you with their Crom. And if you get to Naus at 40 life, it's a lot better than Nausing at 20. And you rely on winning early with a high density of gas because of that. The game doesn't really favor you, especially the more all in you are on early wins, if the game goes long. You're not really built to do that. Like I mentioned, decks like Tymna Crom and even Rogsai, which we'll get to, can lean into that blue-black part of their deck, go for a longer game, sit behind a draw engine. You know, you look like the good guy, and then all of a sudden, you know, Dark Ritual, Calling the Weak, Ad Nauseam, GG. These decks are going to be playing some of the staples we talked about, like Wheel of Fortune, because I have a bunch of cards that make mana in my deck. I expect that I can play a ritual, dump out some mana rocks, cast Wheel of Fortune, and better take advantage of it. And I also got the most card advantage out of it. Like an early wheel, if you're the only one who really developed, vastly favors you versus a wheel where you had to tap out for it and you don't really run that many zero rocks. Like the odds are you're just going to be passing that turn. Necropotence is arguably supplanted Ad Nauseam as the best outlet, just getting access to your deck. We mentioned it combined with Born Upon a Win, lets you in your instep, get all the Necropotence cards, cast Caster Born Upon a Wind, holding 30 plus cards. And if someone tries to interact with it, you have your whole deck's worth of interaction, potentially, lots of it, and can attempt to fire off win attempts. It has more of a combo element on its own and can assemble more cards on average than ad nauseum. These decks are more likely to play stapley rituals. Rite of Flame is an example of like one that's stapley, but not every single red deck in the format will play. They might also play cards like Infernal Plunge, which have a bit more of a cost, or Strike It Rich to help give them mana early. That's leaning more into the Storm decks that we'll talk about, but it's not super uncommon to see that here as well. We mentioned Underworld Breach as a core part of the game and as what I would say is the best win condition in the format. The best part of these decks is that they are the best Underworld Breach decks. Underworld Breach on its own, like we mentioned with Brain Freeze LED, is pretty good, but I mentioned that the card quality of it is higher than Thassa's Oracle, and that's because it assembles its own combo. If I untap, cast one of these rituals I have 4 or 5 mana, whatever. Demonic Tutor just wins me the game because assuming, decent cards in graveyard, I can Demonic Tutor, go get my Underworld Breach, cast my Underworld Breach, escape my Demonic Tutor, go get my LED, escape my Demonic Tutor, go get my Brain Freeze. It's very common for these decks to be able to compactly win because Breach is so self-contained and so absurdly powerful that it's worth jamming very fast wins on low resources because this card enables it in a way that other cards like Thassa's Oracle doesn't help you assemble that combo or make it easy to protect later on. Where Breach, if your opponents are relying on, say, Mindbreak Trap, Underworld Breach gets you access to the interaction in your graveyard that you can use to protect the rest of the pieces of your combo. Beseech the Mirror, which is pretty intensive on the cost, especially triple black, but is going to let you sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token, go get a spell and cast it for 4 or less. This just puts your Necropotence on the stack. It puts your Underworld Breach on the stack and put an extra card in the graveyard. Think about it. Final Fortune is going to be a mainstay of these kind of decks because they want to throw up some mana, maybe Necropotence, or if they're not ready, maybe they have a Naus, but they need to untap first. Cast Final Fortune, get an untap, try to win. You're going to be trying to jam early and often. Intense rituals like Rain of Filth, which has you sacrifice your lands for black mana, going to get you a lot of cards in graveyard for Underworld Breach, as well as just help you turn the corner, especially if you had a slower start, or if you're an Esper core deck that's also doing the Naus Necro plan, that's a card that can let you, without a lot of onboard development, suddenly be able to turn the corner and try to win if you think it's your opportunity to do so. They're going to interact in a way that is more risky and favors an early win attempt. So when paired with blue decks, you might see Daze in a Naus Necro deck. Not going to scale very well in the late game, but very early on, it's a free counterspell that most decks aren't going to have access to. So if you're willing to run more of these effects, you're more likely to be able to protect your early win attempts. Defense Grid is a all-in effect that stops people from being able to play spells on other people's turns. If you don't win the game with Defense Grid, other people now have that effect. So you have to be a little cautious about where you give it to. But also, if you don't respect the table and you think you can go turn 1 Defense Grid, turn 2 win, you can just do that. And a lot of times they won't be able to stop it. You just have to hope nobody else wins, but you're there to jam. And you're going to have cards that care more about protecting your own stuff instead of fighting other win attempts like Redirect Lightning. Some popular commanders in this category. Dargo Tymna is a Naus Necro turbo list. They don't often run ad nauseum. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you'll run Pyreneed Abyss instead, other all-in effects, but their core is still very much about assembling combos by using wheel effects, Underworld Breach, those rituals that I talked about. They get some more specific ones with Dargo that enables cards like Burn Offering to be very powerful, and also their own Dargo-centric combos. So they're a little bit more on the synergistic side of Naus Necro Turbo, whereas a commander like Terra is 5-color good stuff that is often slanted to Naus Turbo because you have a red commander that is milling cards over, so you get access to cards like Flare of Duplication, and you're also just going to have more cards in your graveyard for Underworld Breach. Sort of the de facto commander for this archetype would be Rogsai, using Rograk, who is a enabler for those commander spells that we talked about, as well as some ritual effects like Culling the Weak, Diabolic Intent, getting access to just more stuff than the rest of your opponents. He enables those early game Grixis cards to be online way more often because you guaranteed have access to a commander and a 0-mana creature. Naus Necro Turbo, I think you should play if you enjoy powerful vintage-like gameplay. These are the decks that are the good stuff. These are the people playing this, talk about other decks being cope because they're sitting around hoping to interact, and we're just going to go turn 1 Dark Ritual Necropotence. Very high power, impactful gameplay. You value a high ceiling, even at low mulligans. Like I mentioned, land Dark Ritual Necro, that's a mull of 3 that might win turn 2. You have very very high potential. Your deck is built to turn not much into a win. You're built to explode. And then you don't mind being the threat every game. People are going to assess you like you have the potential to win out of nowhere because you do. That is sort of the downside of being really powerful, but it's good to be the threat because that means you're strong. So these are very fun decks. They can be very intense to learn and intense experience to play, but there's not really anything else like them. They're kind of awesome. Next, we're going to be talking about Simic Big Mana. This is an archetype that didn't really exist in the way it does now before the banning of Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, Dockside, etc. Simic Big Mana leans heavily on permanent mana development. You are not here to cast dark rituals and things like that to hope to make an early win attempt. You are playing spells that make you more mana so that you can play more spells that make you more mana, so that you can eventually turn that into a win. Your pushes often get you ahead every turn. You go bigger than anyone else with cards like Gaia's Cradle. The decks in current cEDH that are using Gaia's Cradle, they're tapping their Cradle for 10 plus mana. That's very hard to deal with anybody. It is the most broken mana enabler, although it does take more work to get it working. But often, even when it's tapping for like 4 mana, that's when you're able to start making win attempts with Cradle focused combo lines. Tapping it and untapping it just becomes very, very powerful and hard to deal with. You often rely on your commander as a mana outlet, either for value or for wins. Kinnan is a good example of a enabler and outlet, but it isn't a traditional Simic Big Mana list like the Gaia's Cradle ones we'll be talking about, but it definitely is in this category. Kinnan looks to use your non-land permanents mostly to develop mana. Thrasios is a big one that is going to be used to turn any generic mana into resources, whether those are lands on the battlefield or cards in hand. Like I mentioned, Gaia's Cradle, this is the card. This is the card that enables this archetype to exist. You often prioritize cheap mana dorks, use your Gaia's Cradle, help develop that stuff early, turn that Cradle into a mana machine, tap it for 4, 8, 10, 30, whatever. Generally, you don't have to get it explosive to like 10 plus mana. Just a thing you can do. I mentioned the creature tutors like Finale of Devastation. Nature's Rhythm is a new option that we've got that works incredibly well with Cradle because of the untappers. These effects are often mana neutral because you get your Cradle, tap it, cast like Nature's Rhythm for X equals 2, and then find a card like Cloud of Fairies that can untap it. Spent no mana, you still have access to a tutor in your graveyard, and your Cradle count has gone up by 1. Like I mentioned, Cloud of Fairies. Other Cradle untappers are very powerful. You can pair these with the clone effects that I mentioned to get more access to these, where I can say I have a Cradle count of 3, cast a Cloud of Fairies, it untaps 2 of my lands, so I now have access to 5 mana because my Cradle count went up. I can then cast a clone Cloud of Fairies, ETB on the stack, float a bunch of mana, untap more, and kind of chain together untappers to go bigger and bigger and bigger. You're also going to run other effects that turn your creatures into mana, like Enduring Vitality, which allows them to become mana dorks, and cards that can enable you to really take advantage of having lots of permanents that make mana, like Seedborn Muse. Pair that with Thrasios or Kinnan, you are dominating the table by just throwing up nonsense onto the board and drawing a million cards. It is disgusting. You're going to pair these with, like I mentioned, clone effects like Phantasmal Image. There's more of them at different mana values depending on what you want to prioritize, especially in those Cradled, typically Thrasios decks, going to be focused on Gaia's Cradle. So access to land tutors like Crop Rotation, new ones that we've got like Vibrance, are going to be pretty big. And then typically because you're running those, you run more of those effects I mentioned like Talon Gates or Emergent Zone because you want other utility effects to make these cards good even when you already have all the other pieces. And then another way that you can sort of interact with people is cloning their stuff, right? They have a Bowmasters like Image, clone yours. And you can also instant speed tutor with cards like Court of Calling. Maybe your opponent has a game-winning combo with a creature on their board and you can Court of Calling and instant speed Gilded Drake it. It's a different way to kind of have access to proactive plays that let you interact and take advantage of your big mana and push you ahead. Like I mentioned, a lot of these, the archetypal kind of generic versions of these are Thrasios decks. Thrasios for 4 mana lets you scry 1, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it into play tapped. Otherwise, you draw a card. You can make a bunch of mana with Thrasios to turn it into a reasonable engine. He kind of sucks normally, but if your Cradle's tapping for 10 and you have like 15 different cards in your deck that untap Cradle, activating Thrasios for 4 doesn't feel too bad. But also with that generic cost, any infinite mana combo that you're able to assemble, whether it's infinite green, colorless, all of your colors, whatever, Thrasios is going to be able to draw your entire deck and go get a win con like that Finale of Devastation to deal infinite damage to your opponents. He's often paired with Rogue Rack, again having a free body, pretty powerful in this format, free commander for those Fierce Guardianship swats, and then also he's a 0 drop for your Cradle. So Rogue Rack decks are the only decks that reliably get access to a Cradle that taps for 1 green on turn 1. Not uncommon for him to be paired with Yoshimaru as well to get access to kind of the higher quality white cards in the format. Generally, red not contributing a ton to Simic strategies right now. Yoshimaru gives you access to cards like Emil, the Silence Effects, Smothering Tithe, just generically good, powerful cards, though he's a little bit more expensive than Rograk. You're also going to have big mana Simic decks that just operate on a different angle than those decks. Kinnan does not guaranteed flip you into, a big creature and guarantee you value, but he on his own is a mana enabler. Like I mentioned, Kinnan's going to care a lot more about mana rocks and dorks than Gaia's Cradle. So he's one of the more different ones, but it's hard not to describe Kinnan as Simic Big Mana. He also gets a huge advantage by just making more mana than the rest of the table. Derevi is interesting in that it often is a mana enabler and not an outlet. Derevi, when it enters, lets you untap, and then your creatures can deal damage to untap. You can see how that with like Gaia's Cradle or other permanents that are making lots of mana lets Derevi be a Bant strategy that just makes millions of mana. And then Aang at the Crossroads it's a little bit different. I'm also going to be talking about it in the Commander Toolbox thing because this is just an odd deck, but this is another deck in these colors, like a lot of Bant decks are this way, that turn big mana into win attempts. If you have tons of mana, Aang and a clone or a doubler just can kind of win the game. It operates a little differently. It's not a clean outlet or clean enabler, but it still, I think, works in this kind of way that other decks that you might be interested in, like Helga, can also kind of operate in. Simic Big Mana, I think you should play if you enjoy traditional Commander gameplay. These are the decks that play the most like souped up casual decks. You're developing a big board, you're making more mana than everybody else, you're going bigger than anyone else can deal with, and playing a more fair-ish strategy, but amped up to beat unfair decks. You want a creature-focused strategy. These are the most creature-focused decks in the format. You really care about your Cradle count. It's very common for these decks to run like 25 to even in like the semi-blue non-interactive sort of list as high as like 40 plus creatures. And then you like figuring out overlapping combos. These decks often win with high card quality infinite mana combos that use overlapping cards. I mentioned Cloud of Fairies. You can use Cloud of Fairies that you tutor for to help pay for the Nature's Rhythm you tutored it for to go get a Boreal Breeze Caller, which is a Cradle combo card with Talon Gates will let you make infinite mana. Again, not going to be going super in depth on every combo, but your ability to turn mana into a win attempt is probably at its highest in these Simic Big Mana decks. 5+ mana and a Spellseeker can often win the game. Red-based Storm. Now, this is a deck archetype that I think people would have just described as turbo, but I think is very different enough and has enough popular decks that I would not throw it into the same sort of archetype as the Naus Necro-based turbo decks. They can overlap. You will have Rakdos decks that are like that, but mostly these are low color red decks that are playing a very different game plan. It's very common they'll use their commander as a mana outlet or an enabler. Decks like Ral look to use their commander to just make their spells cheaper, while decks like Atali use a bunch of mana to pump out their commander and hope that it flips them into a win. They push fast, storm-based, non-deterministic wins, meaning it's very common for someone to ask you, are you going to win on your turn? And you just say, I don't know. And it'd be true because it completely relies on what this Jessica's Will flips over. Now, Jessica's Will is going to make a whole bunch of red mana and exile 3 cards. Maybe it'll win, maybe it won't. Maybe I'll flip nothing. We'll just have to see. You're going to play a lot of cards that let you kind of churn through your deck, meaning take a lot of game actions that let you see more cards, mana neutral, or even sometimes mana positive, and you're trying to just go through. And you have a very volatile game plan because of that. You have a volatile game plan with very big highs and huge lows. These can be decks that mulligan down to 2 and don't do anything, but often they're built to, mull like to 5-ish and then be really threatening. So you're going to run lots of ways to make mana. You're going to run mana batteries, which are cards that when you cast spells will net you mana or take some of the game action that net you mana, right? But they're based on your game actions. Burgi, whenever you cast a spell, you add red. You're going to be able to cast a Burgi, especially if you have something like Ral. That can essentially make all your spells free. When, Ral reduction, Burgi making the red, start casting my zeros. I go to Forcible something, I make a mana about it. You also have more swingy rituals that are maybe even at higher mana values. Something like Goblin, as I like to call them, or Mind Goblin, Sticker Goblin, which is going to make you 4 to 6 mana, depending on your pregame. And then cards like Treasonous Ogre, which lets you just turn life into mana straight up. That you just set this thing down, you have a healthy life total, you're going to be able to do the thing. Some, Atali players sit down Treasonous Ogre, pay 21. Atali on the stat, what you doing? These are also going to run cards that are going to help them keep going, either digging into their deck, and again, can have some random outcomes. So like Past in Flames, you're going to run lots of instants and sorceries that make you mana. You won't typically see Past in Flames in a deck like Atali, because there's not a win con outlet usually at instants and sorcery slot. But if you're playing a bunch of rituals and then cast spells like Inspire Tinkering that find you more cards and maybe are reduced in a deck like Rowan to be very cheap, you can use Past in Flames to refire all these mana positive spells, dig you deeper, and then maybe into something like Mind's Desire, which is completely random. But if your storm is like 25, you're probably going to win off of, however many free spells it gets you. So there's a lot more of that. There's a lot more. Let's see what happens. Their ability to interact is honestly just going to be jamming more most of the time. Cards like Flare of Duplication, which we mentioned in Naus Necro, you're going to see more here to be used on their very big impactful spells instead of as interaction, though it can double as, you can Flare of Dupe a counter spell to counter the counter spell. You might just fire off on top of stuff with a card like Big Score or otherwise other instant speed ability to draw and look at more cards. And you're also just going to play spells that aren't really nice to interact with. Snort is an optional wheel that has flashback. These flashback spells are very difficult to want to interact with, especially if they've already cast a bunch of rituals and have a bunch of mana. It doesn't really seem that worth it. Maybe you just let them take the optional wheel, but then they have it again, and you make these very difficult decisions for your opponents because it's hard to know what is going to be your bottleneck, whether you need mana, whether you need cards, whether you have, a bunch of both in hand, and it doesn't matter what they do. It's very difficult to deal with you, and you typically just aren't there to interact. You are the best deck at just pushing more win attempts and more stuff. This is an archetype that changes a lot based on your commander. Atali, like I mentioned, is an outlet for mana. It isn't really there to make you any. Sometimes it will, but even then, that's there to just help you refire Atali at some point. But you're just taking advantage of your opponents having a bunch of good cards and flipping free stuff and, built around getting more Atali flips. It's very non-deterministic in that way. Ral is kind of the most efficient, scary of these. He's an Izzet commander, which you can't see based on the front, but he is just super cheap, gives you 2 of the better colors for storming, and makes your spells cheaper. And he also gives you an outlet eventually as well, making him like very, very deadly. You want to cast Ral, cast a bunch of spells, flip Ral into where it can ultimate and give you 10 cards off the top, and your instant sorceries are free. Let Ral die, recast Ral, cast another spell for free, flip Ral, and just keep going through your deck until you assemble some kind of win. Rowan is a little bit different than these decks in that it's often not quite as non-deterministic stormy. I think it's the best at closing these games out, but it runs a lot of these same cards, can have a lot of these same play patterns. Establish a commander, get to untap with it, have a huge reduction on your spell that makes it very easy to just keep storming and keep making win attempts and turn a card into a very easy win and just overwhelm the table to where no amount of interaction is able to stop you reasonably. They'll just run out of mana and cards before you run out of spells that win the game. Red-based Storm, I think you should play if you want to jam wins as much as possible. These are the most jam the thing, do the thing. There's not really a backup plan for most of these decks, unlike some of the Naus Necro decks that might lean into Ristic Study or Fish and might play more, sitting back. These decks, you can sit around and just draw cards, but you're not really doing that to have a totally unique game plan. It's mostly just looking for your window to do the same thing you were going to do anyways. They value high potential over slow and steady gameplay. You are the scariest, most deadly decks kind of out of nowhere. You don't often get anything from the game going on, so sometimes your seed order can be more impactful, and also if somebody just happens to have something for you in the early game and the table just kept pretty interactive hands, it can feel bad. But most of the time, through most game plans that people are going to have, you can just absolutely blow people out in ways that they have nothing to do anything about. And then you prefer winning in many different ways. These aren't the kind of decks that just go Thassa's Oracle Console, Breach, LED, GG. They're going to win all kinds of different ways. Atali will flip random stuff off of people's decks, cast it ad nauseum. Rowan will Crick, Villas, Sheoldred you to death, cast Purity of the Abyss. Ral might wheel like 15 times, looping nonsense until they can eventually just brain freeze you out. They might Mind's Desire their deck away. They might go for just straight up natural storm, Grape Shot, or maybe they'll build Infinite Storm with Reiterate. There's all kinds of different options. These are kind of the most flexible decks. Just trying to figure it out as they go along. It's a lot of fun to get to play them. Lands. Now, this is an archetype that basically was non-existent. It wasn't even bad before. It just didn't exist, especially at a competitive level. But it has become quite popular to where I was looking through the most popular decks, and there's just like a couple strategies I could only define as lands decks. They don't really neatly fall into another archetype. In that way, they're some of the most approachable. It's very easy to understand how like a lands Loomer deck works, at least from a vague perspective. The actual combos, not so much. But lands decks develop into high resources and then they pivot into land combos. They are going to look to ramp out their overall number of permanents, use utility lands to be able to interact with people, just develop a bunch of stuff. And then once they get going, they're very difficult to disrupt. It is not easy to stop a lands-based combo. It is very common that once they get their cards in play, they're just not going to cast any spells, to the point where like they put a spell in the stack and all you have is a silence, you just die. It just isn't going to do anything. They're not going to cast any more spells. They're going to flip their deck with Lemora, make infinite things, deal infinite damage, whatever. Because they're not really doing a lot early, even if they're developing a lot of mana, they can often fly under the radar. And also, they're playing with lands. They're very difficult to interact with. And so a lot of the hate pieces, they don't really care about. And also, they might be running them themselves, like cards like Collector Oof. The basic staples of lands, you're probably very familiar with if you're coming from casual Commander. You got exploration effects to play additional lands. Cards that turn lands into mana, like Lotus Cobra and other landfall effects. And then some that you're probably familiar with now, but maybe not, like Springheart Nantuko, which can provide some ridiculous combos. You can like put this on a commander like Lumra. I guess I should go back to Lumra. Lumra I will specifically talk about, as a lot of the lands decks are secret commander Lumra decks, and there's Lumra as a cEDH deck that you can absolutely play. It as like a sort of almost self-contained engine for land-centric combos, just needing an untapper basically lets you go absolutely crazy. It's like completely changed the game. Like the last year and a half of, I guess 2 years at this point, Magic cards have completely changed the strategy, including cards like Nantuko, which came I think a little bit before Lumra. Being able to bestow this on a impactful card like Lotus Cobra or other ones we're going to talk about can just do some absolutely busted stuff when you get extra copies of them and create some infinite loops. It's really good on Icetill Explorer. Icetill letting you play an extra land and from graveyard and milling a card. Huge. This card is like everything a lands deck wanted. It's insane that this thing got printed. It's busted. You're also going to have other cards that let you turn lands into mana. Cards like Squandered Resources are going to be a major part of lands-based loops in the decks that can run it. Sacking a land to add 1 mana will let you perform Aftermath Analyst loops, where you're able to sacrifice your lands, make a copy of Analyst with Shifting Woodland to put it back into the battlefield, just keep looping those lands in infinite mana, but also just make big explosive plays. They're going to interact in land-centric ways. We mentioned crop rotation in the Simic Big Mana decks, but here it's going to have an even wider toolbox to pull from. It could go grab a straight up combo piece like Shifting Woodland. It could go grab Strip Mine to hit that Cradle player's Gaia's Cradle. You could start Strip Mine locking people with your Icetill Explorer and just like do 3-4 strip mines in a turn. You know, that's even the ritual based, artifact based decks are going to have trouble playing through that, especially if you have a card like Collector Oof that you don't really care about. Often their ability to interact is going to depend on how many colors. Decks like Lumra, only stuck in mono green, they might have something like a Tabernacle to hate out creature decks. The higher color you go, the more traditional your interaction can start to look. We mentioned Lumra as an option in mono green. You also have Gitrog Monster in Golgari. This is a deck I've been playing a lot recently that I think is way better than a lot of people understand with some of the new cards it's got and just how quickly it can win. This can play a fair lands, like, you know, play extra lands, mill stuff, draw cards, whatever, until you get your deck more salvage combo assembled. So this can be one of the like most compact lands based decks. You are stuck in Golgari, which is a little bit more than mono green, but whatever. Korvold has some lands based decks that you can play in Jund, get you access to a little bit more stuff like Orcish Lumberjack, as well as just being a generically powerful commander. Even if you don't do land stuff, that gets real busted once you start sacrificing lands. And then Wandering Minstrel, one of the newest 5-colored 2-mana Amulet of Vigor effect and the command zone, kind of nuts for land-centric decks. And this is one that can lean more into that Esper Midrange or Naus Necro. Being in 5 colors gives you lots of options in any commander, but then you also just have lands-based combos as well. So you can see lands decks typically sticking to green. You know, the Simic decks can do some of that too, Golgari. And then once you're in 5 colors, you can do anything, especially with a commander as cheap as Wandering Minstrel. Lands, I think you should play if you enjoy decks that play on a different axis. These are not normal play patterns that you get to experience in cEDH. It's one of the only archetypes that I think totally plays different than other ones in the format, that is completely novel to what it does, and that can often just play a whole different game than anyone else is playing. Just ignore what everybody else is doing or be ignored by others because they just can't deal with you. you prefer more fringe cards and strategies, you're going to get access to some of the wildest cards. You're going to get to do some weird wonky combos that people aren't ready for. You can really get some brewer's advantage just playing a popular lands deck. People just might not know how it works. And if you love lands, like if you want to play a bunch of lands and you like sacking lands and bringing them back and drawing cards and all that nonsense, this is the archetype for you. The last one we're going to be looking at is the Commander Toolbox. Now, this one is the most hard to define in that the commanders often operate differently. Their game plans that are under this umbrella don't all necessarily operate the same way and can play differently, which is part of why Commander's cool. But they have a lot of similarities, and there's enough of them that I would say this is an archetype. Very often, they are going to use their commander as an engine pushing to a combo. Now, this can be that they pull things out, like tutor cards straight into play. It can be that they commander very directly develops to the battlefield. It can be that the commander is virtually there only to enable combos. But these are decks that are going to use their commander first and foremost as their primary way of pushing towards wins. They often have a toolbox of different options to find. Not always. Some of the more non-deterministic ones we'll talk about, they'll have options to find, but not a full toolbox to pull from. But a lot of these can just straight up reach into the deck and grab whatever they need. And then these tend, kind of as you would expect, to be the most commander reliant. These can be among the more consistent decks in the format. They're also kind of the easiest to know how to interact with because it's basically kill the commander or don't let it hit the battlefield. So because these are very commander centric, I'm going to be talking about this through the lens of some of these commanders. It's a little bit different. Magda, when a dwarf becomes tapped, make a treasure, sack 5 treasures, go get a dragon or an artifact. Magda is going to have a toolbox, like I mentioned, of typically artifacts, not as often dragons, but occasionally a dragon or two. Rocco just straight up lets you go get any creature out of your deck. He is basically Finale or Court of Calling, whatever, in the command zone. Sisay is going to be buffed by the colors of other legends you have in play. So as she is tutoring, into play more legends with her ability, she's going to increase in power and the access to other legends she has goes up. So you can often tutor for something that lets you untap to do more of that. So let's look at specifics of how these commanders utilize their toolbox. They each have really simple combos that they themselves can assemble or can be used with them. It gets kind of weird. Magda, it has very easy combos with Clock of Omens with an artifact dwarf to enable you to make infinite treasures to tutor up your deck and do all the stuff you want. There's going to be a really common trend among these toolbox commanders is that they find a thing to help them set up and then they find the thing that combos and then they get everything all at once. Rocco can both get access to food chain by using Rector effect to just put it straight into play. It can find an effect to kill a Rector you already have, or it can find an effect to net you some mana to get this going, or it can just not do all this and assemble its own birthing pod combo. Rocco is probably the most flexible among these and is built to be able to find whatever piece you need. You already have the food chain. You can net the mana with Squee, Rocco your whole deck. If you already have the food chain but no Squee, Rocco can get you the Squee and you're done. But Rocco is super flexible in that regard. Sisay is going to look for legends that get the Sisay count up, net you some mana, and allow you some untaps. Like I mentioned, Derevi is a great example of this. If I have a Bloom Tender that's going to tap for all 5 colors, activate Sisay, using that mana, Derevi enters, untaps Bloom Tender. I now have all 5 colors, activate Sisay again, go get another untapper, etc. They also are going to have a toolbox of stuff to pull from. Magda can, instead of getting a way to win, might see that they're going to get interact with if they do so and go get Portal to Phyrexia to board wipe, reset the board and get them some advantage. Rocco, instead of going for the combo, can just go for protection because they already have it in hand. You can also run different stacks pieces in a deck like that because Drannith Magistrate is also just something you have access to all the time. Sisay can go get disruptive creatures like a Deadpool straight into play, just yoink your commander's text box, or even ones that can help interact with the stack or remove things. Like I mentioned, these are going to be the most commander-centric. They're going to all work a little differently because, in a way, their commander is defining their archetype. Arkham Dagston, kind of similar to a way like Magda, can start doing some activations, do activations that guarantee it more and loop into a whim. Tayam works differently in that it's going to care about your development to the board and need to remove counters to flip into things. But Tayam is very difficult to interact with once it gets going, and it can often loop and make some deterministic combos to get its entire deck win the game, but it isn't necessarily assembling anything guaranteed when you activate it. It's just what's in your graveyard and then once you start flipping. And I mentioned I would talk about commanders like Aang. You could also talk about Winota. Even canon to an extent that will get you access to selection off the top. I don't know if I would actually classify Aang as a commander toolbox card, but you can think of other commanders that are kind of there to be your whole game plan, and especially that give you opportunities to make selection and make choices off of what they do. They're not just predetermined, do this. Now, because of all this, it's really easy to deal with these. Drannith Magistrate, your deck doesn't work. Most of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, Opposition Agent totally shuts them out. And because of that, you're going to want to run a lot of removal, like Swords to Plowshares, bounce spells, etc. But also, it's very good against you. These decks tend to have like the most devoted fan bases. People who love their commanders play these decks and they obsess with them and they goldfish them all the time. And they have like really tight-knit communities. But people are going to kind of learn how to deal with you. Although a lot of times these decks that aren't as popular really get a lot of Brewer's advantage because people just do not know how they work. And you get ultra rewarded for understanding how your deck works at a very high level. So because of that, Commander Toolbox decks, I think you should play if you want a commander-focused game plan, you prefer lists that heavily reward deck knowledge, and you enjoy puzzle-like combo decks. This is the deck for you if you want to pick a commander and play it forever. There's a lot of those kind of people who play these, like the Sisseys and the Magdas, Tiams, etc. They keep playing. They love to just learn more about the deck and find new combo lines and tweak it and figure out the win lines that no one else can figure out. Now, real quick, I'm going to go over some of the resources you can go over to find decks. Now, I could put a list for every one of these archetypes, all the commanders I showed, but it's much easier for you to go to edhtop16.com and just scroll. Just look at Esper Core, mid-range, decks, Simic Big Mana stuff like Rogthras. You have the Atali here, Ral, Kefka, that's leaning maybe more, depending on the build, into the Esper Core. Maybe it's leaning more Grixis and when it's going turbo and is more Naus Necro focus. Other Storm deck options like Vivi. Decks that you can see lean in and out and work in these archetypes in different ways. And if you want to find a deck list, you just go on here, click. I usually will look at something that's pretty recent, like 3 months, and you can just see the best performing decks period that are on here. This is one of the best resources in the game. You can even click on here to find the staples for each of these decks, see how widely played they are, and you can even look at the staples of the format in general, all the card types, and see what's going on. Absolutely one of the biggest resources. Going to be the best way for you to find a deck. Go to EDH Top 16, find a commander that looks interesting to you, and click on that. And if you want to find a tournament that you can play in, you're going to go to topdeck.gg and find events near you. You can find them in different formats as well, like Riftbound and different games, but all the different 10, 20, 50, whatever Ks that are happening that are all over the place. This is the site to do it. Just with these two resources, you have access to every deck you could ever want to see and almost all the tournaments that get held. Most of them are going to be through Top Deck software. It's really easier now than ever to actually get to play cEDH. So, like I mentioned, next time we're going to be going over deep dives on the most popular commanders in the format, explaining a little bit more about the combos, how they work, why some staples are played the way they are, why the decks are the way they are, and how they more specifically play. Focusing in a little bit more from archetypes to decks. Let me know down below what you want to hear from next in terms of this series and getting into cEDH. I want to focus a little bit more on beginner-friendly content that gets people from interested in the format to playing it. Help you get to your first tournament, get to your first pod even, get to sleeving up your first deck. Let me know what you're thinking. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Let me know what I can do better next time, and tell me what deck you're excited to play. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.